The chairman of the committee justified me.
I know things are moving along, and you've begun to take this process seriously, because I've now met your 8th grade nun. She's here today, which means that we better end it. I assume that's why you have her here, is this in the event that somehow we couldn't finish, she would remind me of the fact I said on Friday we were going to finish. So I assure you we have an added incentive to finish today. With that, why don't we write to the order of questioning, Judge, and again, anytime that you would think it's appropriate to take a break, we'll do so. And I think what we should do is sort of play it by ear as to when we have lunch. If it looks, because I'd like to finish before lunch, and lunch, that may mean 12, that may mean 1, but let's make that judgment as we go, if that's all right with you. Okay? All right. The next questioner. I don't know what round it is. Yeah, we're starting. Okay.
Is this the third round?
Yeah. All right. It is now. We
don't have it.
All right. The way where we are now is the next questioner will be the most senior Republican who has any questions, and I yield to Senator Thurman if he has any.
Mr. Chairman, I have no more questions, and none on our side have any except Stevenson from Pennsylvania. I believe he cares for a third round.
This is Senator Thurman of South Carolina.
Senator Bassett, did you have any questions on the third round?
I have used 6 or 7 minutes of the third round and don't anticipate maybe using any more unless something happens.
So you have no more this time. Well, then, Stevenson from Pennsylvania.
We yield to the senator from Pennsylvania.
I thank the chair.
This is Republican Arlen Specter.
If you are confirmed and you join the current revisionist Supreme Court, and I call it a revisionist Supreme Court as opposed to a conservative court, because the current court has gone beyond the conservative judgments illustrative the unanimous opinion of Chief Justice Berger in the Griggs Court, and is a revisionist court now, I think. I would ask if you would be philosophically attuned more to Justice O'Connor line or the Justice Scalia line, and I will deal with 2 cases for illustrative purposes. When I had finished my questioning, my time ran out on the second round. I had been asking you about Rust versus Sullivan. And in Rust versus Sullivan, Justice O'Connor dissented. That was the case where you had a regulation Department of Health and Human Services, which had stood from 1971 to 1988, and then it was, and the Supreme Court upheld its change on a variety of grounds, which I had specified in my last round. But the one which struck me the most peculiarly was that it is appropriate to change a regulation when it is in accord with the shift in attitude. And that had related to, in part, to your compliment of Justice Scalia in your Creighton speech, where he had referred to political considerations on changes in regulations. Justice O'Connor, on the other hand, voted to uphold the original regulation and to strike down the new regulation because, as she put it, it would raise serious constitutional problems and would constitute a serious First Amendment concern. And I would ask whether you would side with the O'Connor branch or the Scalia branch of the revisionist court.
Senator, without reference to Russ, I think, as I attempted to explain when we addressed this last week, Chevron versus USA involved an instance in which EPA changed its regulation an existing regulation concerning the bubble concept. That was a concept that was hotly contested, and EPA had adopted a regulation rejecting the bubble concept, as I remember it. Subsequent to that, EPA revisited the concept and adopted it. And the question was whether or not this new regulation was a reasonable interpretation of EPA's underlying statute, or the statute in that case. And the court held that it was indeed, and upheld the regulation. That is generally the existing line with respect to deference to agencies' reasonable interpretations in the administrative law area. Whether or not that is easily transported to the difficult case that you've just mentioned, or is easily reducible to an instance in which there seems to be just a change in, as you say, shifts in political shifts of attitudes, and whether shifts of attitudes would constitute a reasonable basis for making such a change, or that shift in attitude comports with a reasonable interpretation of the underlying statute is, I think, a totally different question. But the point that I'm making is simply that the Supreme Court has permitted, in the leading case in the administrative law area, has permitted there to be a change of regulations by the agency, even when the existing regulation had been in place for some time.
Judge Thomas, in Russ versus Sullivan, the court concluded that the regulation was acceptable, saying that, quote, the regulations simply ensure that appropriate funds are not used for activities, including speech, that are outside the federal program scope. That ruling gives me enormous concern. It's given many, many people in this country enormous concern in light of the very extensive federal rule on funding. So that if you have a federal program which is funding a given activity, and you say that no one can speak in opposition to that program, there is an enormous latitude for restricting freedom of speech. And my question to you is, do you think that it is appropriate, when there is federal funding involved, to limit speech when that speech is outside the federal program scope?
Senator, I think that in this case, with respect to the question, the underlying question in Russ v. Sullivan, that I think it would be, from my standpoint, moving too far to comment on the underlying issues. As I've indicated in other instances, Senator, in these difficult cases, and it's important to me that I not compromise my impartiality should cases of this nature, similar cases, be considered by the Supreme Court in the future, if I'm, of course, fortunate to be confirmed.
But Judge Thomas, I'm not asking you about any specific issue, let alone any specific case. I'm asking you about a very broad philosophical question. It's as broad as the areas of federal funding, which are gigantic, and it's as broad as the First Amendment freedom of speech, which we hope even exceeds the breadth of federal funding. And the issue is, just because the federal government gets into funding and establishes the scope of a program, and I'm not talking about any specific issue, doesn't that give you at least some concern about limitations on speech, if you can curtail speech where federal funding is involved?
I think, as I suggested last